Picture this. You are 10 years old, standing barefoot on cold stone floors in the Tower of London on a suffocating summer morning in 1483 AD. The air hangs thick with the stench of rotting meat from the kitchens below, mixed with something far worse, the sweet metallic smell of death that seems to seep from the very walls. Through the narrow windows, you can hear the distant cries of street vendors hawking their wares, but their voices sound muffled and far away, like echoes from another world, a world you can no longer reach. Your name is Edward V, and you are the rightful King of England. At least, that's what they told you before they brought you here. Before the heavy wooden doors locked behind you with a sound like thunder. Before your Uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, smiled that cold smile and promised you were being taken somewhere safe, somewhere protected. The irony tastes bitter on your tongue as you press your small hands against the iron bars of your window, watching the Thames flow endlessly toward a freedom you'll never see again. Your younger brother Richard, Duke of York, sits huddled in the corner, his 9-year-old frame shaking with fever. The plague has come to London again, as it does every few years like clockwork, and the tower has become a tomb for the living. The guards who once bowed when they saw you now avoid eye contact, their faces hidden behind cloth masks soaked in vinegar and herbs. They know what you're beginning to understand. You're not here for protection. You're here to disappear. Before diving into this forgotten story of innocence destroyed by ambition, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. The summer of 1483 was a season of death in more ways than one. London sweltered under temperatures that seemed to press down like a heavy blanket, trapping the stench of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies in the narrow streets. The plague had returned with a vengeance, spreading through the crowded tenements and grand palaces with equal hunger. But for two young princes locked in the bloody tower, the disease stalking the city was the least of their concerns. Edward V had been king for exactly 78 days when his world collapsed. 78 days of wearing a crown that felt too heavy for his small head, of sitting through council meetings where grown men spoke in whispers and avoided his gaze, of trying to understand why everyone seemed so afraid. His father, Edward IV, had died suddenly in April, leaving behind a kingdom on the edge of civil war, and two sons who had no idea they were about to become pawns in a game far deadlier than chess. The boy, who should have been king, was small for his age, with the pale complexion and delicate features that marked him as his father's son. But where Edward IV had been a warrior king, tall and commanding, young Edward was bookish and gentle, more comfortable with Latin texts than battle strategies. His tutors praised his quick mind and his facility with languages. They said he would make a scholar king, a ruler who would bring learning and culture to England. None of them mentioned that he would need to live long enough to wear the crown. His brother Richard was even smaller, a wisp of a boy who followed Edward everywhere with the devoted loyalty of a faithful dog. At 9 years old, he still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. He still thought their Uncle Richard was the hero of their story, the loyal duke who would protect them from harm until Edward came of age. The innocence in his dark eyes would break your heart if you could see it, knowing what was coming for these children who had committed no crime except being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The Tower of London in 1483 was not the tourist attraction it would become centuries later. It was a fortress, a prison, and an execution ground, all rolled into one massive complex of stone and iron that squatted on the banks of the Thames like some medieval monster. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, the dungeons deep enough to swallow men whole, and the history dark enough to stain every stone with blood. It was here that kings had been made and unmade, where traitors had breathed their last, where the machinery of royal power ground human lives to dust with mechanical precision. The princes had been brought here under the pretense of preparation for Edward's coronation. Their uncle Richard, now Lord Protector of the realm, had explained it all so carefully. London was dangerous, full of enemies and plague. The Tower was the traditional place for monarchs to stay before their crowning. It would only be for a few weeks, just until the ceremony could be arranged and the kingdom made stable. He spoke with such sincerity, such apparent concern for their welfare, that even the adults believed him. Or perhaps they simply wanted to believe him because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and still no coronation came. Instead, whispers began to circulate through the court, like poison in the bloodstream. Whispers about the legitimacy of Edward's claim to the throne, about secret marriages and bastard children, about the need for a strong hand to guide England through troubled times. The same nobles who had knelt before 10-year-old Edward began to bow to his uncle instead, their loyalty as changeable as the weather and twice as unreliable. Inside the Tower, the princes felt the shift like animals sensing an earthquake. The servants who had once attended them with elaborate ceremony now performed their duties with the mechanical efficiency of people caring for the condemned. The guards who had once stood at respectful attention now watched them with the calculating eyes of jailers. The food that had once been served on golden plates now came on simple pewter, and sometimes not at all. The plague crept closer with each passing day. They could hear it in the increased activity in the courtyard below. The constant coming and going of carts loaded with bodies wrapped in stained sheets. They could smell it in the smoke that rose from the burning pits outside the city walls, where London disposed of its dead-like refuse. They could feel it in their own bodies as fever came and went, as their appetites disappeared, as their strength slowly ebbed away like water from a cracked vessel. Young Edward tried to maintain the dignity of his royal blood, insisting on proper prayers each morning and evening, attempting to continue his studies even as his hands shook with weakness. He wrote letters that were never sent, composed speeches for a coronation that would never come, and planned reforms for a kingdom he would never rule. His brother Richard grew quieter and more withdrawn, spending hours staring out the narrow windows at a world that seemed to grow more distant with each sunset. The summer dragged on like a fever dream, each day blending into the next in an endless cycle of heat, sickness, and growing despair. The guards stopped coming altogether in late August. The heavy footsteps that had once echoed through the corridors 3 times daily, bringing meagre meals and emptying chamber pots, simply ceased. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Edward pressed his ear to the thick wooden door, listening for any sign of life beyond their prison, but heard only the scratching of rats in the walls and the distant tolling of church bells marking the hours of their abandonment. Richard had stopped eating days earlier. The fever that racked his small frame left him delirious, calling out for their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, begging to go home to sanctuary. Edward held his brother's burning hand and whispered stories their nurses had told them as children, tales of brave knights and rescued princesses, of justice triumphant and evil vanquished. The irony was not lost on him that he was living in the opposite of every fairy tale he had ever heard. By September, the stench from their chamber had become unbearable. With no servants to maintain even basic sanitation, the princes lived in conditions that would have horrified their former courtiers. Edward, still trying to preserve what remained of their dignity, had torn strips from his velvet doublet to create makeshift bandages for the sores that covered Richard's body. The plague had taken hold with vicious efficiency, turning the younger boy's skin grey and his breath shallow and laboured. The sounds from the courtyard below had changed too. Where once there had been the bustle of daily life, now there was only the occasional clatter of cartwheels and shouted orders. London itself was dying, consumed by the same plague that was devouring the princes. Their uncle Richard had fled to the countryside with his court, leaving the capital to rot like a corpse abandoned by the roadside. Even the tower's garrison had been reduced to a skeleton crew, men desperate enough to risk infection for the promise of steady wages. Edward knew they were going to die. The knowledge settled over him like a shroud, not with panic or rage, but with a strange kind of peace. He was 10 years old and already tired of fighting a battle he could never win. His brother's breathing had become so faint, it was barely perceptible. Each exhale might be his last. The boy who should have been king knelt beside the boy who should have grown up to be a duke and prayed for forgiveness for sins he had never committed and mercy he would never receive. On a grey morning in early September, when the Thames fog rolled through their window like ghostly fingers, Richard of York drew his final breath. Edward felt his brother's hand go limp in his own, watched the slight rise and fall of his chest simply stop, as if his soul had finally found the strength to escape their stone prison. The silence that followed was absolute, more complete than any quiet Edward had ever experienced. He was alone now, truly alone, the last Plantagenet prince in a tower full of shadows and death. Edward lived for 3 more days after his brother's passing, too weak to move Richard's body, too exhausted to cry any more tears. He spent those final hours writing in a prayer book with a piece of charcoal he found near their cold fireplace, scratching out words that no one would ever read about the injustice of their fate and his forgiveness for those who had abandoned them. His final entry, barely legible, simply read, "God save England, for we could not." When the skeleton crew finally found the princes, drawn by the smell of death that even thick stone walls could not contain, they discovered 2 small bodies embracing in the corner of their chamber. Edward had pulled his brother close in those final moments, as if his failing warmth might somehow bring comfort to them both. The men who found them were hardened soldiers who had seen countless battlefields, but several wept openly at the sight of these children who had been sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. Their uncle Richard, now crowned King Richard III, received word of their deaths with public sorrow and private relief. The princes who had been inconvenient obstacles to his reign were now simply tragic casualties of plague and circumstance. History would remember him as the last Plantagenet king, but it would also whisper of the nephews who disappeared in his tower, the boys who died so that he might live as a king. The bodies of Edward and Richard were buried quietly in an unmarked grave somewhere within the tower grounds, their location lost to time and deliberate secrecy. Centuries later, when workmen discovered the skeletons of 2 children beneath a staircase in the White Tower, many believed they had found the lost princes. But the truth died with them in that plague-ridden chamber, taking with it the last echoes of their frightened voices and the final gasps of the Plantagenet dynasty. The boy king, who never ruled, left behind only questions and shadows. A ghost story written in stone and silence. His tragic end reminds us that power is always hungry, always willing to devour innocence to satisfy its appetite. In the Tower of London, where the Thames still flows as it did 5 centuries ago, you can almost hear the whispered prayers of 2 children who learned too late that royal blood offers no protection against the cruelty of ambitious men and the indifference of history itself.